In a small village lived an elderly woman named Margarita. She raised her grandson Alexi from an early age, and they always had a very close relationship. When Alexi grew up, he continued to visit his grandmother often, and this did not surprise anyone. In village life, it was common for grandchildren to maintain contact with elderly relatives. But as time went on, something changed. Alexi began staying with his grandmother for longer periods, and this began to raise questions among the neighbors. They noticed that Margarita and Alexi avoided communicating with others and rarely left the house. Rumors began to circulate, but no one could have imagined that their relationship had crossed the line. The situation escalated, and the relationship between them became more and more tense. Alexi, feeling confused, did not know how to break this connection. Ultimately, all this led to a tragedy that shook not only their family, but the entire village. One night, a tragedy took place in Margarita's house, which would soon become known to everyone. Margarita was born and raised in the same village where she spent most of her life. It was a small but cozy place where everyone knew each other and family values were passed down from generation to generation. She grew up in a family with strict moral principles. Margarita's parents were always an example for her. Her father, who worked the land, was a man of strict rules, and her mother was a housewife and raised children. She instilled in her daughter the basic qualities of caring for loved ones and devotion to family. This became the foundation of her life, and in the future, these are the values Margarita will bring to her family. In her youth, Margarita was an energetic and cheerful girl. Her smile and friendliness attracted the attention of many guys, and there was no one in the village who did not know her. She quickly married a local guy named Ivan. Their marriage was an example to everyone. It seemed that they were ideal for each other. Ivan was a hard-working and honest man, and their union was considered strong and happy. After the wedding, Margarita and Ivan began to build their lives. Soon they had children, 2 sons who became the main meaning of their lives. Margarita was always a caring mother, ready to do everything for her children. She completely immersed herself in the role of a housewife and keeper of the family hearth, following the same principles that she was taught as a child. Her whole life revolved around her family, and she never complained about her fate. However, life often presents unexpected challenges. Ivan passed away early, when their children were still very young. This blow was unbearable for Margarita, but she continued to live for the sake of her sons. All her energy was now spent on raising the boys. She devoted herself to their education, helped with homework, and always tried to give them a better future. A few years passed, and her eldest son started his own family, and the youngest, Alexi's father, soon married too. This was the time when Margarita first felt that her role as a mother was receding into the background. She was still an important part of her children's lives, but now they had their own families and concerns. It was at this point that her grandson Alexi became the one who filled her life with meaning again. With the birth of Alexi, Margarita seemed to feel again the joy she had felt when her own children were small. Alexi was not just a grandson to her. He became the center of her universe. She spent all her free time with him, spoiled him, fulfilled all his whims. He grew up under her supervision, and even when his parents were busy, the grandmother was always there. In the eyes of all the villagers, Margarita was an example of a devoted and caring grandmother. However, over the years, her attachment to Alexi began to take on more complex forms. Her children had long since grown up, her husband had died, and she was left alone. Her grandson became the only close person she could spend time with. She felt that she was needed by someone again, that she could take care of someone again, as she had done before with her children. But on the other hand, this feeling gradually grew into something more. Margarita began to feel an attachment to Alexi that went beyond the usual grandmotherly feelings. Against the background of this emotional dependence, her behavior began to change. She became more jealous when Alexi began dating other girls, often expressing dissatisfaction with his friends and hobbies. This behavior alarmed those around her, but no one could think that there was something more behind it than just a grandmother's desire to protect her grandson. Margarita never told anyone about her thoughts and feelings. She was a woman of the old ways, brought up in strictness and morality, and even the thought that her feelings could go beyond what was permitted was unacceptable to her. However, over time, her emotional attachment to her grandson became so strong that she could no longer restrain herself. Her inner world was full of contradictions. On the one hand, she understood that her behavior was wrong. On the other, she could not cope with her own emotions. Margarita's past, upbringing, and moral principles collided with the new reality she found herself in. Her whole life had been built on caring for others, on being useful to her family. When her children grew up and became independent, she felt an emptiness that she could not fill with anything other than her relationship with Alexi. With each passing day, her dependence on her grandson grew stronger and the tension inside her grew. She left the house less and less, spent more and more time with Alexi, as if trying to keep him away from the outside world. No one could predict how it would all end, but the internal conflict that raged in Margarita's soul was only the beginning of what would soon develop into a tragedy. Alexi was born into a family that faced many difficulties from the very beginning. His father, Margarita's youngest son, was always a man with a difficult character. In his youth, he was quick-tempered and had a desire for independence, which did not always fit into family traditions. He married a girl from a neighboring village early, but their marriage was not cloudless. Quarrels, misunderstandings, and financial difficulties haunted the young family from the very beginning. When Alexi was born, his parents were already going through a crisis in their relationship. The young mother spent a lot of time at work, trying to help the family financially, and the father was often absent, immersed in his own affairs. As a result, Margarita became the person who took on the main care of the newborn grandson. From a very early age, Alexi spent more time with his grandmother than with his parents. Margarita literally dissolved in caring for him. Her home became a second home for the boy and soon the first. Alexi spent almost his entire childhood under the care of his grandmother. Margarita protected him from all difficulties, trying to compensate for those shortcomings that could arise as a result of the unstable relationship of his parents. She surrounded him with love and attention, trying to create ideal conditions for him in which he would not feel a lack of anything. Margarita was not just a caring grandmother. She literally replaced Alexi's mother. With each passing year, their bond became stronger. Alexi had been a withdrawn child since childhood, and this only strengthened his attachment to his grandmother. He felt safe with her, and despite his parents' attempts to improve their relationship with their son, Alexi always preferred to spend time with his grandmother. Those around her saw this as ordinary grandmotherly concerns, nothing more. In the village, it was accepted that older generations help raise children, and no one was surprised that Margarita was so attached to her grandson. But few guessed that it was this early and too strong emotional dependence that would become the basis for the future tragedy. When Alexi went to school, his attachment to his grandmother did not weaken. He grew up a quiet, withdrawn boy who had practically no friends. At school, he kept to himself, rarely interacted with his classmates, and always hurried home to his grandmother after classes. She supported him in everything. She helped him with his homework, took care of his nutrition, and looked after his clothes. Alexi's parents, immersed in their own problems, practically did not participate in his upbringing, which only increased the boy's dependence on Margarita. Margarita, in turn, was becoming more and more drawn into this role. She saw Alexi not just as a grandson, but also as her savior from loneliness. Her children had long since grown up, her husband had died, and only Alexi remained in her life who truly needed her. She tried to do everything to make the boy comfortable, and with each passing year their bond became closer and closer. During his school years, Alexi began to notice that his relationship with his grandmother was different from what he saw in his peers. His classmates talked about their parents. Their advice and support seemed natural to other children. But Alexi was used to discussing his problems and worries only with his grandmother. His mother and father were still a part of his life, but their influence became less and less significant with each passing year. They often argued, which only increased Alexi's desire to distance himself from them. When Alexi reached adolescence, the situation began to escalate. He began to feel more and more confused. His body and mind were changing, and he found it difficult to find answers to the many questions that tormented him. Usually, at this age, teenagers turned to their parents or friends, but Alexi continued to turn only to his grandmother. This caused him an internal conflict. He understood that their relationship was not quite normal, but he could not understand what exactly was wrong. Margarita, in turn, began to behave more and more possessively. She did not approve of Alexi leaving home more and more often, meeting with friends, or being interested in girls. Every time he tried to expand his social circle, she expressed dissatisfaction and tried to bring him back under her control. She was afraid of losing him because he was the only person who gave her life meaning. When Alexi started dating a girl from a neighboring school, Margarita was very worried and expressed her disagreement in every possible way. She convinced him that no one could take better care of him than she could. This period became a key one in Alexi's life. He had a hard time coping with the pressure his grandmother was putting on him, and at the same time he felt the need for independence. He often tried to distance himself from Margarita, made new acquaintances, but each time he returned to her. It was a vicious circle. His grandmother skillfully manipulated his feelings, making him feel guilty for spending less time with her. Alexi, not fully understanding what was happening, became increasingly entangled in these emotional networks. Despite his attempts to improve his personal life, Margarita was not going to let her grandson go. Over the years, her possessive feelings only grew stronger, and she began to put even more pressure on him. She controlled his every move, constantly trying to find out who he was communicating with, what he was doing, and where he was going. Alexi felt increasingly constrained in this relationship, but he could not break it off because he still felt a strong attachment to his grandmother. This difficult period lasted for several years. Alexi finished school and decided to stay in the village near his grandmother. Although his friends left for the cities, striving for a new life and freedom, he stayed, continuing to be under the influence of Margarita. She supported this decision in every way, happy that Alexi would remain near her. However, the situation became more and more tense with each passing day. Alexi's internal conflict grew, and he increasingly understood that his relationship with his grandmother could not continue in the same spirit. As Alexi grew older, the relationship between him and his grandmother began to change. He increasingly wanted to spend time with friends and take an interest in life outside the home. This was natural for his age, but Margarita could not accept the fact that her grandson was gradually moving away. She was used to being his only source of support and care, and this situation began to worry her. With each passing day, her sense of control over Alexi's life only grew stronger. She began to notice that he was leaving the house more often, staying late with friends, or paying attention to girls. This made Margarita feel jealous, although she did not immediately understand why it was so difficult for her to come to terms with the changes in her grandson's life. In her eyes, Alexi remained the same little boy who always needed her help and support. One day, Alexi brought home a girl he had recently met. They were planning to spend time together, and Margarita, noticing this, could barely contain her displeasure. Throughout the evening, she watched with a tense gaze as Alexi and his new girlfriend talked and laughed. Her irritation grew, and soon she could not stand it. The moment the girl left, Margarita approached her grandson with harsh words, condemning his choice and expressing dissatisfaction with his company. Alexi was stunned by his grandmother's reaction. He was used to her care and support, but now he saw a completely different side of her character, demanding and domineering. This quarrel became the beginning of a protracted period of tense relations between them. Margarita did not want to let her grandson out of her life, and Alexi increasingly strove for independence. Over time, their conflicts became more frequent. Margarita increasingly expressed her dissatisfaction with his attempts to start a new relationship, even pointing out that no one could care for him the way she did. Her words sounded more and more insistent, causing Alexi to have internal doubts. He began to feel guilty for wanting to live his own life, and did not understand how to cope with this pressure. One day, after yet another argument, Alexi realized that their relationship had reached a new level of complexity. Margarita no longer hid her jealousy, and her behavior became increasingly obsessive. She constantly sought to control his time, communication, and relationships, instilling in him the idea that without her, his life would not be as full and secure. The internal conflict in Alexi's soul was growing. He understood that something was wrong in their relationship, but he could not find a way out of this situation. Every time he tried to distance himself, his grandmother did everything possible to bring him back under her control, manipulating his feelings and making him feel guilty. The situation worsened when Alexi finally realized that his relationship with his grandmother had become unhealthy. However, he could not break this connection. He had been dependent on her support and love for too long. There were no other people in his life who could help him cope with these difficulties, and he sank deeper into this psychological trap. The tension between them grew stronger with each passing day. Alexi felt that he could no longer continue to live in this state, but deciding what to do next was a huge challenge for him. In small villages, any deviation from the usual way of life quickly becomes a subject of discussion. This is what happened with the relationship between Margarita and Alexi. At first, these were just fleeting conversations, when neighbors discussed how often Alexi spent time with his grandmother. But gradually, suspicions began to grow, and rumors became more and more persistent. Local residents noticed that Alexi was spending more and more time with Margarita and leaving their house less and less. Many of the neighbors had long observed how protective the grandmother was of her grandson. Margarita seemed to be more than just a caring relative. Her desire to control every aspect of Alexi's life became all too obvious. People said that Alexi hardly communicated with his peers, avoided girls, and rarely went outside the house. All this began to seem strange, and neighbors whispered that the relationship between them had become too close. One day at a local fair, several women started talking about Margarita and her grandson. "Have you seen how he's always at her place? He doesn't even make friends," one of them said. Another added, "I don't want to gossip, but something's not right. They're always together, and he doesn't even try to meet girls." The talk began to spread, but no one dared to speak out. In such small communities, people were used to the idea that family was sacred, and interfering in other people's affairs was unacceptable. Meanwhile, Alexi's family was also beginning to notice changes. His parents, although not as closely involved in his life, began to realize that something was wrong. His father, who had always believed that his mother Margarita was helping him raise his son, began to doubt that such influence was useful. Alexei spoke to his father less and less, avoided discussions about the future, and showed virtually no interest in his personal life. His mother also noticed that her son was becoming increasingly withdrawn, but she did not dare intervene, believing that Margarita, as always, knew best how to take care of him. The situation within the family began to escalate when Alexi stopped attending family events and increasingly refused to communicate, even with close ones. One day at dinner, his father tried to find out what was going on. He asked Alexi several questions about how things were going and why he spent so much time at his grandmother's. Alexi remained silent, and then, unable to withstand the pressure, He got up from the table and left. This was the beginning of a serious rift in their relationship. The father realized that he had lost contact with his son, but did not know how to restore it. The mother, although she loved her son, felt helpless. Her own relationship with Margarita had always been complicated. Margarita, as the head of the family, always dictated her rules, and Alexi's mother, having become accustomed to this, did not try to resist. However, now she began to realize that her passivity only exacerbated the problem. Doubts arose in her soul. Was Margarita exerting too much influence on Alexi? But she still did not dare to discuss this openly with her husband or with Margarita herself. Soon, Alexi's father, feeling that the situation was getting out of control, decided to talk to Margarita. He came to her house, hoping for a frank conversation, but Margarita, as always, was able to convince him that everything was fine. She said that she was simply taking care of her grandson, that Alexi himself chose where to spend his time, and that all of this was temporary difficulties that would soon pass. The father, although he felt that this was not the whole truth, could not object. Margarita always knew how to manipulate people, instilling in them a sense of guilt or insecurity. Meanwhile, the talk in the village continued. The neighbors increasingly discussed the strange behavior of Alexi and Margarita. Some recalled how Alexi used to be more sociable, always found time for his friends and seemed happier. Now he avoided people, and this made everyone wary. It was as if he had completely withdrawn into himself, said one of the neighbors. I think he's just afraid to distance himself from her, answered another. Margarita, of course, noticed that her relationship with her grandson was becoming a subject of discussion, but she did not attach much importance to it. In her eyes, there was nothing strange in the fact that Alexi spent so much time with her. She considered herself the only person who truly cared for him and understood him. For her, public opinion did not matter, and she was sure that she was doing everything right. However, the social pressure began to take its toll on Alexi. He felt that people were judging him, although no one had said so directly. He was confused. On the one hand, he felt a strong attachment to his grandmother, but on the other, he knew that their relationship was beyond what was considered normal. This internal struggle was wearing him down, but he could not find a way out. Over time, Alexi became increasingly withdrawn from the outside world. His friends, with whom he had previously communicated, began to distance themselves from him, as he increasingly refused to meet and preferred to stay at home. He felt that their opinions and advice only increased his internal conflict, while his grandmother, on the contrary, tried to convince him that he did not need to communicate with anyone else. All this gradually destroyed Alexi's psyche. The internal conflict between his duty to his grandmother and his desire for freedom made his life unbearable. He was increasingly alone with his thoughts, immersed in feelings of guilt and helplessness. His psychological state was getting worse, but no one around him could notice it or understand how deep his problem was. Margarita, in turn, continued to increase her influence on Alexi. She increasingly withdrew into her own world, where she was convinced that her love and care were all her grandson needed. She did not realize that her actions were only making the situation worse, making him even more dependent on her. Thus, tensions within the family and pressure from society grew. Rumors, family conflicts, and internal discord in Alexi's soul led to the situation reaching a critical point. For many months, Alexi and Margarita continued to live in their closed reality, almost completely isolated from the outside world. With each passing day, their relationship became more and more confusing and complicated, but they carefully hid it from everyone. For most people in the village, as well as for close relatives, their relationship remained a secret behind the doors of Grandma's house. Hidden from prying eyes, this relationship took on increasingly disturbing forms. Margarita, who had always been a source of support for Alexei, now became the person whose emotions and actions completely controlled his life. She continued to instill in him the idea that no one needed him except her, that no one could love him the way she did, and that all his attempts to start a relationship or friendship with someone else were doomed to failure. Her jealousy became more and more obvious, but Alexi could not resist it, being captivated by feelings of guilt and fear that he could lose her. Margarita, realizing that her control over her grandson could weaken, began using various methods to keep him around. Her behavior became increasingly manipulative. She used her emotional outbursts, threats that she would become ill or that she would be left alone if Alexi decided to leave. These manipulations put enormous pressure on Alexi, who felt responsible for his grandmother's well-being. He could not allow himself to simply leave, knowing that she was counting on him. However, Alexi began to understand that their relationship could not continue in the same spirit. Thoughts about changing his life were increasingly appearing in his head, but every time he tried to take a step towards independence, Margarita did everything possible to bring him back under her control. One day, Alexi tried to start a relationship with a girl he liked. She lived in a neighboring village, and this was his first serious step towards getting out from under the influence of his grandmother. However, when Margarita found out about these meetings, her reaction was extremely painful. She played out a real drama in front of Alexi, convincing him that he was betraying her trust, that he was leaving her alone, that now that he had found another woman, he would no longer need her. These words deeply hurt Alexi. He again felt strong pressure and guilt. It seemed to him that if he continued to meet this girl, he would betray his grandmother, who had been with him since childhood and always helped him. Alexi again withdrew into himself, and his attempts to improve his personal life failed. But despite her external calm and control, Margarita's internal state became increasingly tense. Her fear of losing Alexi was so strong that she lost control of her emotions. Sometimes, in fits of jealousy and anxiety, she would throw tantrums, accusing Alexi of no longer loving her and of being useless to anyone. Alexi, seeing her state, did not know what to do. He was afraid that if he left, he would leave her in trouble. In this environment, the tension between them continued to mount. Alexi was depressed. His emotional state worsened with each passing day. He felt as if he was trapped, with neither the strength nor the ability to escape from this situation. His friends and acquaintances did not understand why he increasingly avoided meetings and conversations. Alexi distanced himself from everyone, afraid that if someone found out about what was happening between him and his grandmother, it would ruin their lives. Margarita, for her part, was increasingly obsessed with the idea that she could lose Alexi. She jealously watched his every move, restricted his freedom, and even controlled his meetings with friends and colleagues. Her control became more and more intrusive, and Alexi increasingly felt that his life no longer belonged to him. It was as if he was locked in a golden cage, where he was loved, but where he could not breathe freely. One day, Margarita went even further. She began to instill in Alexi thoughts about how they should always be together, that he should not start a family or have children, because no one could love him the way she did. These conversations caused Alexi deep confusion. He did not understand what was happening. On the one hand, he felt strong feelings of affection and gratitude towards his grandmother, but on the other, his mind told him that all this went beyond the bounds of a normal relationship. Margarita continued to make things worse. She tried to isolate Alexi from the outside world, telling him that no one would be able to understand their relationship, that people would judge them if they knew the truth. She also began to intimidate him, saying that if anyone found out about how they lived, their lives would be destroyed. Alexi was completely confused. He did not know who to trust or what to do. His guilt about betraying his grandmother did not allow him to escape from this trap. Meanwhile, the relationship between them continued to remain a secret for everyone around. No one in the village guessed how deeply distorted their connections were. Margarita masterfully hid her true face, continuing to play the role of a caring grandmother. Alexi, afraid of condemnation and not understanding how to cope with this situation, also did not dare to talk about what was happening. Those around him only saw a withdrawn young man who communicated less and less with people and was increasingly immersed in himself. The secrets they kept from everyone became an ever heavier burden. Alexi felt that his life had become a vicious circle from which there was no escape. His mental and emotional state was deteriorating, but he could not find a way to break these painful bonds. Margarita, sensing his inner struggle, tried even harder to keep him close to her, not realizing that this only made the situation worse. Over time, the tension between them reached a critical point. Alexi was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and Margarita, feeling her control weakening, became increasingly aggressive in her actions. The secret they had so carefully hidden was about to explode, and the consequences could be devastating for both themselves and those around them. The situation between Margarita and Alexi continued to escalate. Outwardly, they remained grandmother and grandson, supporting each other, but in reality their relationship had long since entered the realm of emotional dependence, which was beginning to destroy them both. Each new day brought more and more tension, and the situation was gradually approaching the point where neither of them would be able to remain in this state. Alexi increasingly felt that he could no longer live under Margarita's control. He was in a constant state of internal struggle. On the one hand, he could not bear to stay with her, knowing that his life was no longer his own. He wanted to start a new life, to free himself from her pressure, to build his own relationships and find his place in the world. But on the other hand, he still felt a deep sense of guilt and obligation to his grandmother. He remembered how she had helped him as a child, how she had supported him when his parents were too busy, and this did not give him the opportunity to take a decisive step. At the same time, Margarita became even more controlling and jealous. She noticed that Alexi was trying to distance himself from her, and this caused her to panic. Her fear of losing him was so great that she began to take even more extreme measures to keep him close to her. She tried to limit his communication with the outside world, constantly instilling in him that no one but her could understand and support him. Every time Alexi tried to go somewhere or meet friends, Margarita would make a scene. She would start crying, saying that she would feel bad if he left and that she would no longer be able to live if she was alone. Her emotional blackmail became more and more sophisticated, and Alexi, not knowing how to cope with it, gave in to her demands again and again. At one of those moments when Alexi was about to go to a meeting with his former classmates, Margarita threw another tantrum at him. She literally stood on the threshold, not letting him leave the house. Her voice was trembling with hysteria, and her eyes were full of tears. "You're betraying me. How can you leave me for these people? I've taken care of you for so many years, and now you're leaving me alone," she screamed. Alexi stood silently, not knowing what to answer. His body seemed to have frozen, and thoughts were swarming in his head about how he couldn't leave her, even if it ruined his life. In the end, he stayed home, and the meeting with friends never took place. That evening, Alexi sat in his room for a long time, feeling how his internal conflict was becoming more and more unbearable. He understood that he could not continue to live like this any longer, but he did not know how to find a way out of this situation. Margarita, feeling her victory, calmed down for a while, but her control over Alexi became more and more desperate. She began to monitor his every move, checking his phone, monitoring his correspondence and calls. She tried to isolate him from everyone who could somehow influence his decision to leave her. Alexi became more and more depressed and detached. His social connections practically disappeared, and the feeling of loneliness and hopelessness grew. Against this background of emotional pressure, Alexi began to experience mental health problems. He often fell into depression and was visited by thoughts that his life had lost its meaning. He saw no way out of this situation, feeling as if he were trapped, where his every action was controlled by another person. Even when he was alone, he could not get rid of the feeling that Margarita was always nearby, watching him and expecting complete submission from him. One day, in a fit of despair, Alexi tried to talk to his grandmother about how they needed to somehow change their relationship. He carefully began to explain to her that he wanted to have more freedom, that he needed time for himself, and that he wanted to build his own life. But Margarita didn't let him say a word. She immediately began to sob, hugging him and saying that he didn't understand how much she had done for him, how much she loved him. "You are my only family," she said through tears. "If you leave, I will be all alone. I can't stand it." These words deeply hurt Alexi. He felt guilty again, as if his desire to become independent was a betrayal of her. He withdrew into himself again, realizing that trying to change the situation only made his suffering worse. At this point, the tension reached its peak. Alexi was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, and Margarita continued to put more and more pressure on him. She did not understand that her actions were only worsening her grandson's condition. In her eyes, everything she did was an expression of care and love, but for Alexi, it became an unbearable burden that he could no longer bear. One evening, when Alexi was about to leave the house again to take a walk and get away from what was happening, Margarita tried to stop him again. But this time, Alexi couldn't take it anymore. His emotions, which he had been holding back for a long time, burst out. He shouted at his grandmother, saying that he couldn't live like this anymore, that her control was ruining his life. Margarita was shocked by this turn of events. She didn't expect Alexi to react so sharply. "You want to leave? You want to leave me alone?" she asked with horror in her voice. Alexi, looking her straight in the eyes, answered, "Yes, I can't be here anymore. I need to live my life." These words pierced Margarita like a knife. She fell silent, not knowing what to say. Alexi was overcome with a feeling of relief, but at the same time he realized that he had taken the first step towards destroying their relationship. That evening marked the beginning of the end of their relationship. Margarita, realizing that her control over her grandson was weakening, became even more desperate in her attempts to hold on to him. She began to threaten that, if he left, something terrible would happen. But Alexi could no longer remain in this relationship. He needed to get out of this vicious circle, even if it meant a complete break with the person who was so dear to him. Soon, events began to develop rapidly. Alexi began to spend less time at home, trying to avoid conflicts with his grandmother. But Margarita was not going to give up. Her fear of losing her grandson completely took over her mind, and she began to prepare to take the last, desperate step that would change their lives forever. From this point on, the escalation of tension reached a critical point, and the tragedy that had long been brewing was just around the corner. Everything that had built up between Margarita and Alexi over months of tension had led to an inevitable denouement. The evening when Alexi first announced his intention to leave was a turning point. Margarita could not come to terms with the idea that her grandson, who had been by her side all his life, had finally decided to leave her. For her, it meant the end of everything, the life she had built around him, the control that gave her a sense of power and significance. Alexi, on the other hand, felt for the first time that his life could change. But neither of them knew that these changes would be catastrophic. After Alexi announced that he could no longer be under his grandmother's care, Margarita fell into despair. Over the next few days, she did everything she could to regain control of the situation. She tried to convince Alexi that his decision to leave was wrong, reminded him again and again how much she loved him, and made him feel guilty for wanting to start an independent life. But Alexi remained firm. He avoided meeting her, trying to spend as little time at home as possible so as not to get into another conflict. This only increased Margarita's despair. Scary thoughts began to form in her head. She could no longer control Alexi using her usual methods, and her fear of losing him grew stronger. At some point, she realized that if Alexi left, her life would no longer have meaning. This fear became the main driver of her actions in the following days. She was obsessed with the idea of keeping him at any cost. Margarita began to behave more and more strangely. She followed Alexi's every move, checked his phone, tried to find out who he was talking to, where he was going. She even began to threaten him that if he left, she would do something terrible to herself. Alexi, however, tried not to succumb to her manipulations, but the pressure was unbearable. Every time he entered the house, he was overcome with anxiety. He knew that something was about to happen between them, but he did not know when or what exactly it would be. The night before the tragic events, Alexi decided to finally leave home. He told Margarita that he was leaving and that his decision was final. These words were a real blow to her. She cried, begged him not to leave, but Alexi was not going to change his mind. For him, this was the moment when he decided to finally free himself from the shackles that had bound him to his grandmother for many years. He packed his things and left the house, promising to return for the rest later. Margarita was left alone. She spent the entire evening sitting in her room, replaying the events of the last few days in her head. Her mind could no longer adequately perceive reality. All she saw in front of her was Alexi's betrayal. She could not believe that the one who had been the meaning of her life was now leaving her forever. Her thoughts began to take on increasingly dark shades. An idea appeared in her head. If Alexi did not stay with her of his own free will, she had to stop him at any cost. The next morning, Alexi returned for the rest of his things. The house was quiet, and at first glance, everything seemed calm. He went inside and did not see his grandmother. She was sitting in her room, silently watching him pack his things. Margarita looked strangely calm, which made Alexi a little uneasy. He asked her if everything was okay, but she just nodded without saying a word. Alexi continued packing, unaware of what was waiting for him. At some point, Margarita came out of her room. She had a kitchen knife in her hand. Alexi, busy with his own affairs, did not notice it at first. She approached him slowly, as if she could not fully comprehend what she was going to do. Alexi raised his head, and at that moment their gazes met. In her eyes, he saw something he had never seen before. It was not fear, not despair. It was determination. He managed to utter only one word, "Grandma?" when she suddenly struck. The first blow landed on his side, and Alexi, not understanding what had happened, instinctively grabbed the wound. Margarita, as if in a trance, continued to strike. She could no longer stop. Her entire consciousness was focused on one thing. If Alexi could not be with her, then no one would. His screams echoed throughout the house, but at that moment, time seemed to not exist for the two of them. Alexi fell to the floor, trying to defend himself, but his strength was leaving him. At that moment, he realized that his grandmother, who had taken care of him all his life, had now become his killer. This realization was terrifying, but he could no longer change anything. The last minutes of his life were full of pain and horror at the fact that he had not managed to free himself from this relationship, and that the person he once loved had now destroyed his life. Margarita stood over him, looking at the blood that was covering the floor. Her hands were shaking. The knife fell from them, and she realized, as if waking up, what she had done. She fell to her knees next to Alexi's body, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. His eyes were closed, and the life had left his body. Her screams echoed throughout the house, but no one could hear them. Margarita sat next to Alexi's body for several more hours. She didn't know what to do next. Everything that was in her life disappeared at that moment. She couldn't believe that she had come to this, but in her head she still thought that she had done it for him, for their connection that no one could destroy. When the police arrived at the crime scene, Margarita was still standing next to her grandson's body. She was arrested without resistance, but she kept repeating that she did it because she could not live without him. The neighbors, having learned about what had happened, were shocked. No one could believe that an ordinary, seemingly caring grandmother could kill her grandson. This incident shook the entire village. Every house discussed what had happened, trying to find answers to questions about how this could have happened. Alexi was young and full of energy, and Margarita was an elderly woman who had taken care of her family all her life. But the truth turned out to be much more complex and darker than anyone could have imagined. The tragedy that unfolded within the walls of their home became a vivid example of how destructive unhealthy emotional connections and psychological pressure can be. Margarita and Alexi were bound by a relationship that had long gone beyond the norm, and its outcome was catastrophic for both. When the police arrived at the crime scene, Margarita was sitting in a state of complete shock next to Alexi's body. His blood had already caked on the floor, and the knife she had used to commit the murder was lying nearby. Margarita did not resist arrest. She seemed indifferent to what was happening, as if her consciousness was somewhere far away, and her reality no longer mattered. The police officers who entered the house were shocked by what they saw. The old woman, whom everyone knew as a caring grandmother, was sitting next to the bloody body of her grandson, as if she did not understand what had just happened. Immediately after her arrest, Margarita was taken to the police station for questioning. However, her behavior was strange and inconsistent. She would cry, remembering the moments spent with Alexi, and then suddenly become cold and distant, as if immersed in her thoughts. Investigators tried to figure out what exactly caused the murder, but Margarita could not give a clear answer. She repeated the same phrase. "He couldn't leave. I couldn't let him leave." These words sounded like a mantra, like a last desperate way to justify her actions. The news of the tragedy spread quickly throughout the village and surrounding area. For the small community, it was not just a shock, it was a real shock, because no one could believe that Margarita could commit such a terrible crime. Everyone knew her as a kind and caring woman who always put her family first. No one guessed what passions were hidden behind the doors of her home, or how far her relationship with her grandson went. Neighbors, family friends, even close relatives. Everyone was confused and could not find an explanation. The streets of the village were full of talk about what had happened in those days. Many recalled how Margarita and Alexi had often appeared together before, seemed inseparable, but in recent months they had become increasingly withdrawn. Neighbors began to recall strange moments. Alexi seemed depressed. He communicated with friends less and less, avoided meetings, and seemed increasingly detached. Some said that they had seen him with bruises, but did not attach any importance to this, writing it off as random incidents. It was especially hard for Alexi's parents. His father, who had recently tried to talk to his son and mend fences, could not believe what had happened. It was a double blow for him. On the one hand, he had lost his son; on the other, his mother, Margarita, had been the one who had taken his life. He was in shock and did not know how to react. A feeling of guilt overwhelmed him. He remembered all the times when he could have intervened, when he could have noticed the strange behavior of his son and his mother, but he had not. Now everything was lost, and the memories of what could have been tormented him. Alexi's mother, lost in her grief, could not believe that her son had died in such a way. For a long time, she had not interfered in the relationship between Margarita and Alexi, trusting that her grandmother knew how best to raise her grandson. Now, she realized that this attachment had turned out to be destructive. Her pain and regret seemed unbearable. After the murder, questions began to arise in the village about how such events could have happened in such a quiet, calm family. Many believed that the house had always been idyllic, that the grandmother and grandson were inseparable. However, with each passing day, new details began to emerge that forced everyone to reconsider their opinions. Some of the neighbors began to share their suspicions that had arisen long before the tragedy. People recalled strange conversations, moments when Margarita showed excessive concern for her grandson, her jealous glances when Alexi communicated with someone else. One of Alexi's friends recalled how they saw each other less and less in recent months. Alexi began to avoid meetings and even began to talk less. He seemed depressed, tired, as if something was weighing him down. But no one paid any attention to this at the time, because everyone thought that his grandmother cared for him as if he were her own son. No one could imagine that something darker and more destructive was hidden inside this care. The investigation into the murder took several weeks. The police tried to collect all possible evidence, interviewed witnesses and relatives, studied Alexi's correspondence and phone calls. However, everything indicated that the murder was committed in a fit of despair when Margarita could not cope with the thought that Alexi was leaving her forever. She did not plan to kill him in advance, but her emotional instability, which had increased in recent months, led to a tragic ending. Margarita was sent for a psychiatric examination. Doctors found that she had suffered from various mental disorders for many years, which worsened as her dependence on her grandson developed. Her jealousy and fear of losing Alexi led to her losing control of her actions. Experts concluded that at the time of the murder, Margarita was in a state of affect caused by a combination of mental disorder and acute emotional stress. During the trial, Margarita looked weak and depressed. Her lawyers insisted that she could not fully understand her actions. However, the fact of murder was obvious. The judge listened carefully to both sides, taking into account all the circumstances of the case. During the trial, new details of their relationship came to light. Doctors and psychologists said that Margarita was emotionally dependent on her grandson, that her feelings of jealousy developed into a pathological condition, which led to the tragedy. Many of the villagers came to the trial to find out how the story would end. Some felt sorry for Margarita. Others condemned her. All were shocked by how deeply unhealthy her relationship with Alexi had been and how far it had gone. Ultimately, the court sentenced Margarita to a long sentence in a psychiatric hospital. She did not fully comprehend what had happened, but after the verdict was announced, she seemed calm, as if everything that had happened had been inevitable. After the trial, life in the village changed. Neighbors continued to discuss what had happened, but most of them tried to stay away from the topic. People who knew Margarita and Alexi were shocked that something like this could happen to their seemingly ordinary and quiet family. Every day on the street, someone remembered them, wondering what could have been done to prevent this tragedy. Alexi's family continued to live with a deep wound in their hearts. His father withdrew into himself, unable to find solace or answers to his questions. His mother still suffered from guilt for not noticing earlier what was happening in the home of her son and mother. They both realized that their inaction, to some extent, led to this terrible end. This story remained in the memory of everyone who knew Margarita and Alexi. It became an example of how unhealthy emotional connections and the inability to cope with internal demons can lead to devastating consequences. The people living in this village could never again look at those things that seemed normal and familiar to them with the same serenity. After Alexi's murder, investigators took up the case with special care. The murder of a grandson by his own grandmother shocked even the most experienced police officers because such tragedies were extremely rare in quiet villages. From the very beginning, investigators understood that this case was much more complicated than just a domestic murder. It concealed a dark story of addiction, jealousy, and psychological problems that led to such a terrible ending. The initial picture of the crime seemed relatively clear. Alexi had died from multiple stab wounds inflicted by his grandmother Margarita in her home. But investigators sensed there was more to it and decided to delve deeper into the lives of the two. The goal was to understand what events led to this tragedy, what Margarita's ulterior motives were, and what had really been going on behind closed doors over the years. Interviewing witnesses. The first step for the investigators was to interview all the witnesses and people who knew Margarita and Alexi in one way or another. The operatives began to go around the village, talking to neighbors, friends of the family, and Alexi's parents. Despite the general shock of what had happened, the villagers could not provide many specific details. Most of them only recalled that in recent months Alexi had become more withdrawn, avoided communication, and almost never left the house. They saw how Margarita became increasingly protective of him, and their relationship became increasingly strange. The investigators paid special attention to the conversation with Alexi's friends. One of his closest friends, with whom they had been in contact since school, said that Alexi had been in a severe depression in recent months. He often complained about his grandmother, who did not give him peace and controlled his every step. According to the friend, Alexi even tried several times to leave the village and start his life anew in the city, but Margarita always found a way to convince him to stay. These confessions led the investigators to the idea that Alexi was emotionally dependent on his grandmother, and this became a key element in understanding the motives for the murder. The investigators also contacted Margarita and Alexi's relatives. His father said that several months before the tragedy, he tried to improve relations with his son, but he constantly avoided talking. The father noticed that something was happening between Alexi and his grandmother, but did not attach much importance to it. He assumed that Alexi was simply going through a difficult period in his life and that his grandmother was trying to help him cope with it. Alexi's mother also admitted that she suspected that something was wrong in the relationship between them, but never interfered, thinking that Margarita knew better how to treat her grandson. Psychological examination. Investigators realized that the key to solving this case lay in Margarita's mental state. They ordered a psychological examination to find out what exactly could have pushed her to such a terrible act. The doctors who worked with Margarita quickly came to the conclusion that she suffered from a serious mental disorder. Her condition at the time of the murder could be described as acute psychosis, caused by a combination of long-term emotional dependence and the fear of losing Alexi. During the examination, it became clear that over the course of many years, Margarita had developed a pathological attachment to her grandson. She saw him not just as a loved one, but as the only meaning of her life. After her husband died and her own children grew up and began to lead independent lives, Alexi became her only close person. She devoted herself entirely to caring for him, and over time, this care turned into an obsessive desire to keep him close at any cost. Psychologists explained that her condition worsened with each passing year. She could not cope with the thought that Alexi could leave her. When he began to show a desire to live his own life, it was a real blow to her. Margarita could not perceive his attempts to distance himself as a natural desire of an adult to start an independent life. For her, it was a betrayal that she could not accept. This feeling of betrayal and fear of losing Alexi became a catalyst for her aggressive actions. The inner world of Margarita. Margarita herself said little during interrogations. She constantly repeated that she loved Alexi and could not let him go. For her, he was the only one who truly cared about her. Her testimony was full of contradictions. On the one hand, she claimed that she did everything to protect her grandson. On the other, her words demonstrated deep emotional instability. She could not explain her actions logically, and investigators quickly realized that her mental state at the time of the murder was far from normal. During the investigation, new details began to emerge. It turned out that Margarita had been trying to isolate Alexi from society for a long time. She did not allow him to make friends, interfered in his personal life, and interfered with his attempts to build relationships with girls. Her jealousy of any external contacts Alexi had become stronger and stronger. She was sure that only she knew what was best for him and that no one could replace her in his life. These unhealthy attitudes ultimately led to her deciding to commit murder. Telephone records and correspondence. During the investigation, investigators studied Alexi's phone records and correspondence. They hoped to find additional evidence that could shed light on what was happening in his life in the last months before the murder. It turned out that Alexi had discussed his desire to leave the village and start a new life with friends and acquaintances several times. He said that he felt trapped and did not know how to escape his grandmother's control. These messages only strengthened the investigators' suspicions that Alexi was under constant psychological pressure. One message sent a few days before the tragedy attracted particular attention. In it, Alexi wrote to a friend, "I can't live like this anymore. Every day I feel like I'm being strangled. If I don't leave now, I'll never be able to." This message was the last straw that led investigators to conclude that Alexi had tried to escape his situation, but had failed to do so in time. Results of the investigation. The investigation revealed that Margarita had acted under severe emotional stress caused by her dependence on Alexi. She could not accept the fact that he could leave her life, and in a fit of jealousy and fear of losing him, she decided to commit murder. Investigators concluded that this was not a pre-planned murder. Rather, it was the result of accumulated emotions that found their destructive expression at a fateful moment. The investigation also revealed an important detail. The mental health system in the family was completely destroyed. Relatives, friends, and even neighbors who noticed signs that something was wrong between the grandmother and grandson preferred not to interfere. Everyone relied on the family to solve their problems themselves, and no one realized that the situation was so serious. This incident became a tragic lesson for everyone who knew Margarita and Alexi. It showed how important it is to pay attention to the signs of emotional dependence and psychological problems in family relationships, and how quickly these problems can develop into a catastrophe if measures are not taken in time. After the initial investigation was completed, witness and family interviews allowed investigators to delve into the psychological world of Margarita and Alexi. However, to fully understand the dynamics of their relationship and determine the exact nature of the events that took place on that fateful day, police needed to involve professional psychologists and criminologists. The specialists began an in-depth analysis of Margarita's mental state and attempted to recreate the emotional and psychological processes that led to the murder. Psychological degradation of Margarita. During her first interrogations, Margarita showed virtually no emotion. She spoke in a monotone voice, often got confused in her testimony, and could not clearly formulate her thoughts. On the one hand, she seemed shocked by what had happened, but on the other, she demonstrated surprising calm, as if she did not fully understand the seriousness of what she had done. When asked why she had killed Alexei, she answered quietly, "He couldn't leave me. I couldn't let this happen." Investigators immediately noticed that her condition clearly went beyond the bounds of ordinary emotional stress. For her, Alexei was not just a grandson. He had become her obsession, the meaning of her life, the only thing that kept her from being completely alone. Psychologists began to consider the possibility that Margarita suffered from a pathological addiction that had worsened over the years. Gradually, this addiction developed into something darker and more destructive, turning the caring grandmother into a dangerous person. One of the key points that caught the experts' attention was that Margarita had always perceived her relationship with Alexi as the only way to feel needed. Her husband had died many years ago, and her children, having reached adulthood, had led their own lives, visiting their mother less and less. Her feelings for her grandson were a manifestation of a deep emotional emptiness that she could not fill with anything else. This attachment turned into an obsessive need, and the moment Alexi wanted to leave, her world collapsed. Psychologists found that Margarita suffered from borderline personality disorder, which was aggravated by deep emotional trauma from the past. Borderline personality disorder manifested itself in severe mood swings, unstable relationships with loved ones, and fear of abandonment. Her relationship with Alexi was not just family care. It was a form of emotional control caused by the fear of losing the only person close to her. When Alexi tried to distance himself from her, her mental state deteriorated sharply. The fear of losing him became so intense that she perceived it as a threat to her entire life. Interrogation of Margarita. Margarita's interrogations were difficult and unpredictable. At first, she often had emotional outbursts, cried, and blamed herself for not being able to save Alexi. She repeated that she only wanted to help him, that she could not bear the thought that he would leave and never return. However, after some time, her emotions suddenly changed to calm. She could calmly talk about the details of their life, about how she cared for her grandson, how he was everything to her. These mood swings caused anxiety among the investigators. Her condition was unstable, and they understood that deep psychological problems were hidden behind this external fragility. One episode of the interrogation stood out to investigators. When one of the detectives asked a question about the moment she picked up the knife, Margarita fell silent for a moment. She stared into space, as if lost in thought, and then quietly said, "I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted him to stay with me." These words emphasized that her actions were not dictated by a rational decision. Her mind was overwhelmed by emotions she could no longer control. Investigators tried to understand at what point Margarita lost control of herself. To this, she replied, "I don't remember how it all started. I just knew that if he left, I would be alone, and I couldn't bear it." This confession shed light on her motivation. Margarita was most afraid of loneliness. For her, Alexi was an anchor that kept her from total collapse. When he tried to free himself from her influence, her fears took over, and she was unable to cope with herself. Psychological analysis of Alexi. Although Alexi could no longer tell his version of events, psychologists conducted a thorough analysis of his behavior and emotions based on stories from friends and family, as well as correspondence and diaries that were found in his room. It turned out that Alexi had been in a state of deep depression for a long time. His psychological state was severely undermined by the pressure that his grandmother put on him. He felt that he could no longer live the way he had lived before, but he did not know how to break out of this situation. In a correspondence with one of his friends, Alexi described feeling like he was being suffocated. He couldn't bring himself to leave because he felt obligated to his grandmother for all the years she had devoted to him. He found it difficult to accept the idea that his departure could ruin her life. Alexi was emotionally confused and felt trapped, not knowing what to do. His attempts to distance himself from Margarita only increased her pressure on him. Another important detail was that Alexi did not have enough support from his family and friends. His parents were busy with their own problems, and his friends, although they noticed his changes, did not understand how deeply he was immersed in this emotional trap. Alexi was alone in his suffering, and no one was able to offer him help in time. This internal conflict, connected with a sense of duty to his grandmother and the desire to start a new life, eventually led him to a tragic end. Interrogations of relatives and friends. Interrogations of Alexi's parents also proved very informative. His mother admitted that many years ago she noticed how Margarita began to show excessive care for her grandson, but did not attach much importance to it. It seemed to her that her grandmother simply wanted to maintain a close relationship with Alexi, and she did not see anything wrong with this. However, over time she began to notice that Alexi was becoming more and more withdrawn, stopping communicating with friends and avoiding communication with his family. But Alexi's mother did not intervene, believing that all this was temporary. Alexi's father also felt guilty for not being able to intervene in time. He admitted that he was often busy with work and did not pay enough attention to his son. In his eyes, Margarita had always been a reliable person, and he relied on her in matters of upbringing. Only now, after the tragedy, did he understand that his inaction was one of the reasons for what happened. He did not notice that their relationship had gone beyond the usual and that Alexi was in a deep emotional crisis. Alexi's close friends told investigators that in the months leading up to the murder, he had been in touch less and less. He began to avoid meetings, refused offers to spend time together, and stayed home more and more often. Some friends recalled that Alexi talked about feeling like he was in a cage, that his grandmother was not letting him breathe. But no one could have imagined that things would go so far. For them, these were just conversations about family difficulties that seemed temporary. Final psychological assessment. Based on the results of all the interrogations and examinations, it became clear that Margarita suffered from a severe mental disorder that had been destroying her personality and relationships with others for years. Her pathological attachment to Alexi had turned their relationship into something painful and destructive. In her head, the fear of loneliness had become an obsession, and she could not accept the fact that Alexi, having become an adult, would want to start his own life. This fear led to the tragic outcome. Alexi, in turn, became a victim of this addiction. He was under the control of his grandmother for a long time and could not free himself, as the feeling of guilt and duty to her put too much pressure on him. He could not find support either in his family or among friends, and his internal conflict became deeper with each passing day. In the end, his attempt to leave led to Margarita deciding to take extreme measures. Thus, the psychological assessment showed that the murder was the result of years of emotional abuse and addiction that led to the tragedy. As the investigation continued and the details of Margarita and Alexi's lives became more detailed, new facts began to emerge that added a darker color to their story. Investigators gradually realized that what appeared to be a simple murder in a state of passion was only the tip of the iceberg. It turned out that behind this crime lay a long-term dynamic of suppression, manipulation, and deep psychological problems that had, until then, remained hidden from everyone who knew the family. The influence of Alexi's childhood. One of the most important aspects that came to light during the investigation concerned Alexi's childhood. Although Alexi's parents were always considered a part of his life, their involvement in his upbringing was minimal. Alexi's father was immersed in his work and rarely spent time with his son, and his mother, preoccupied with her own problems, often left the care of the child to Margarita. This created a deep emotional rift between Alexi and his parents, which was one of the reasons why he became so dependent on his grandmother. From childhood, Margarita took responsibility for Alexi's upbringing. At first, it seemed natural. She took care of him when his parents couldn't. However, over time, her role in his life became not just supportive, but dominant. She instilled in him the idea that he was needed only by her, that she was the only person who truly understood and cared for him. When Alexi became a teenager, his bond with Margarita became even stronger. It was a time when he, like any young man, was looking for independence, but his quest was met with stiff resistance. Margarita did not want to let him go into the world, constantly telling him that no one could take better care of him than she could. Her pressure led to Alexi feeling trapped, which had a strong impact on his mental state. He could not break free from her control because he felt enormous guilt for leaving her alone. The role of parents in relationship dynamics. Alexi's parents also played an important role in how his relationship with his grandmother developed. Their detachment and non-interference allowed Margarita to completely absorb Alexi. His mother, who noticed some warning signs, never dared to confront Margarita openly. She often said that mother knows best, and thus encouraged this excessive interference in her son's life. Alexi's father, in turn, was too busy with his career and was practically not involved in his life. As the investigation continued, investigators began to realize that Alexi's family had far more internal problems than they initially appeared to have. Although the parents claimed to be a normal family, In reality, they were completely oblivious to what was happening to their son. This lack of attention and support, especially during his teenage years, increased Alexi's dependence on his grandmother. Her control became his only norm, and he simply did not know how to live any other way. Investigators began to see that this scenario was doomed to tragedy. Alexi, who did not know how to build his own relationships and live independently, became a victim of manipulation and psychological pressure from his grandmother. He tried to get out of it, but every time he tried, Margarita found a way to bring him back under her control. Her influence was so strong that he simply could not leave her. The diaries found. One of the most significant discoveries during the investigation was Margarita's personal diaries, which were found in her home. These diaries, spanning many years, turned out to be a treasure trove of information about her inner world and her thoughts about her grandson. Reading these entries gave investigators new insight into her psychological state and the motives that ultimately led to the murder. In her diaries, Margarita wrote detailed accounts of her life with Alexi. At first, her entries seemed harmless. She talked about how proud she was of her grandson, how much time they spent together, and how much she cared for him. But as Alexi grew older, the tone of her writing began to change. They began to include hints of jealousy, control, and fear that he might leave. She wrote that she could not imagine her life without Alexi, that she was afraid that one day he would leave her and that she would be left alone. In one of her diaries, written shortly before the murder, Margarita openly expressed her anxiety about Alexi starting to date a girl. She described her thoughts that this girl was trying to steal him from her, that Alexi was betraying her trust by building his life away from her. These entries showed that her sense of control over Alexi was gradually developing into an obsession. She could no longer perceive him as a separate person. She saw him as an extension of herself, and his attempts to free himself from her caused her deep pain and anger. The entries also showed that Margarita suffered from severe depression. She often wrote about her life after her husband's death, about feeling unwanted, about how her children rarely visited her. These feelings of loneliness and meaninglessness led her to see Alexei as her only source of happiness. His departure meant the complete collapse of her existence. Revelations from friends and colleagues. In parallel with studying the diaries, investigators continued to talk to people who knew Alexi. During these conversations, new facts began to emerge that confirmed the theory that Alexi was in an emotional trap. His friends said that he tried to leave his grandmother more than once, but every time he talked about it with her, she began to manipulate his feelings. She made him feel guilty, instilled in him that he was obliged to take care of her for the rest of her days. One of Alexi's friends said that they met in a cafe a few days before the murder. Alexi seemed depressed and desperate. He said that he could no longer live with his grandmother, that he wanted to leave, but did not know how to do it without hurting her. "I feel like she is strangling me, but if I leave, she will not survive it," Alexi admitted. These words became further evidence that he was in a state of deep internal conflict. Some of Alexi's colleagues also confirmed that in recent months he had often spoken about his desire to change his job and place of residence, but had not taken any decisive steps. Every time he was going to change something, something stopped him. Now, the investigators understood that this something was Margarita and her emotional dependence on him. Conclusions from new facts. As investigators gathered all this new information, the picture became clearer. Alexi's murder was not the result of a single moment of rage or despair. It was the culmination of years of complex and painful relationships built on emotional dependency, manipulation, and deep psychological problems. Margarita, who had lost all sense of reality, could not bear the thought of Alexi leaving her. For her, it was tantamount to losing her own life, and her psyche could not withstand the strain. This incident became a tragic reminder of how important it is to notice the signs of psychological dependence and emotional pressure in family relationships in time. If someone from Alexis or Margarita's circle had intervened in time, perhaps this tragedy could have been avoided. However, unfortunately, no one noticed how deep these problems had gone until it was too late. Now that all the facts were known, investigators were preparing to take the case to court, where it would receive its final assessment. After a long and painstaking investigation, the moment came when the case of Margarita and the murder of Alexei was brought to court. It was a high-profile case that attracted the attention of not only the village, but also the general public. Everyone expected that the trial would shed light on the tragedy that had occurred in their family and give a final assessment of Margarita's actions. Opening of the trial. The trial began with the presentation of all the facts and evidence collected by the investigation. Lawyers for both sides, the prosecution and the defense, immediately realized that this case would not be easy. At first glance, everything seemed obvious. Margarita killed her grandson by inflicting multiple knife wounds on him, but her motives and mental state at the time of the crime made the situation much more complicated. Margarita appeared in court as a physically weakened and emotionally exhausted woman. Her behavior in the courtroom was strange. At times she appeared completely detached, as if what was happening did not concern her, and at other times she began to cry, uttering incoherent phrases about how she never wanted to hurt him. These emotional outbursts only reinforced the assumptions that her mental state was unstable. Even before the hearings began, the defense announced its intention to base its defense on the fact that Margarita suffered from serious mental disorders and was in a state of affect at the time of the murder. A psychiatric examination conducted during the investigation confirmed that Margarita had been diagnosed with mental illnesses, including borderline personality disorder and depression, which significantly affected her behavior and perception of reality. The experts concluded that at the time of the murder she was in a state of acute emotional breakdown. Witness testimony. The key moments of the trial were the testimony of witnesses. The courtroom featured Alexi's close friends, his parents, neighbors, as well as psychologists and experts who studied Margarita's condition. Each witness added new details to the overall picture, revealing the depth of the problem that this family faced. Alexi's friends described him as a withdrawn, depressed young man who was trying to find a way out of his emotional dependence on his grandmother, but was unable to do so. They recalled him complaining about feeling trapped and being tormented by guilt towards Margarita every time he thought about leaving her. One of his friends even mentioned that a few days before the murder, Alexi talked about leaving and starting a new life, but he did not know how to do it without ruining my grandmother's life. Alexi's parents also testified. The father admitted that he had not paid enough attention to his son, and that only after the murder did he realize how serious the situation was. He spoke of his suspicions about the relationship between Margarita and Alexi, but admitted that he had not tried to intervene, believing that these were family matters that should be resolved independently. Alexi's mother, on the contrary, said that she felt helpless when she saw how her son was increasingly falling under the influence of his grandmother, but did not dare to confront Margarita. Neighbors recalled how Margarita increasingly isolated Alexi from the outside world. They said that in recent months Alexi hardly left the house, and that his meetings with friends and relatives became increasingly rare. Some neighbors admitted that they noticed how Alexi looked depressed and exhausted, but did not know what was behind it. The court paid special attention to the testimony of psychologists and psychiatrists who examined Margarita's condition. They confirmed that she suffered from serious mental disorders, which were aggravated by her long-term emotional dependence on Alexi. The experts explained that her condition was so serious that she could not actually adequately perceive reality at the time of the murder. In their opinion, her actions were dictated not by malicious intent, but by an emotional and psychological breakdown caused by the fear of loss. Arguments of the prosecution. Prosecutors for the prosecution insisted that, despite Margarita's mental state, she was aware of her actions. They pointed out that Margarita had repeatedly expressed jealous and controlling intentions toward Alexi. The prosecution emphasized that she had deliberately isolated him from society, instilled in him a sense of guilt, and effectively deprived him of the opportunity to build his own life. Prosecutors cited as evidence recordings of telephone conversations and correspondence between Alexi and friends, in which he talked about his intention to leave, but each time he encountered manipulation from his grandmother. This evidence became key to the prosecution, as it showed that Margarita deliberately kept Alexi under her control. In addition, the prosecution pointed to Margarita's diaries, which were found in her home. In these entries, she repeatedly expressed her fear that Alexi might leave her and her determination not to let this happen. In one entry, she wrote outright, "I will not let him go. No one has the right to take him away from me." These entries showed that her actions may not have been spontaneous but dictated by deep inner convictions. Defense arguments. The defense, in turn, based its case on evidence that Margarita was not aware of her actions at the time of the murder. The lawyers emphasized that her mental state was extremely unstable, which was confirmed by the results of a psychiatric examination. They claimed that Margarita could not control her emotions and actions when she felt that she was losing Alexei. The main argument of the defense was that Margarita acted in a state of affect caused by her psychological instability. The lawyers insisted that the murder occurred at the moment of acute emotional breakdown, when her mind was overwhelmed by panic and fear of loneliness. They asked the court to take into account her age, mental state, and the fact that she had never previously shown aggression. Margarita's closing remarks. Before the judge and jury had to reach a verdict, Margarita was given the opportunity to make her closing argument. She looked tired and dejected, but there was sincerity in her voice. She cried as she spoke of how much she loved Alexi and how she could not imagine her life without him. "I never wanted to hurt him," she said. "I couldn't let him go. I lost myself when I realized I would be alone." Her words caused mixed emotions in those present. Some felt sorry for her, realizing that her life was full of fear and pain. Others, on the contrary, saw in her words an attempt to justify herself for what she had done. But one thing was clear. Margarita was a deeply broken person, and this tragedy was the result of many years of unresolved psychological problems. The court's verdict. After several days of hearings and reviewing all the evidence, the judge and jury reached a verdict. Margarita was found guilty of murder, but given her mental state and age, the court decided to mitigate her sentence. Instead of imprisonment, she was sent to a psychiatric clinic for long-term treatment. The court concluded that she posed a threat to herself and others, but her mental disorders required professional help rather than harsh punishment. The verdict caused a mixed reaction among the public. Some believed that she deserved a harsher sentence, while others believed that the court acted fairly given her condition. But everyone agreed on one thing. This tragedy became a vivid example of how unresolved psychological issues and emotional dependency can lead to devastating consequences. Margarita remained in the clinic, where she was to spend the rest of her days under the supervision of doctors. After the court delivered its verdict and Margarita was sent to a psychiatric clinic for compulsory treatment, life in the village began to return to its usual rhythm. But the traces of the tragedy that unfolded in the family will be felt among the residents for a long time. Alexei's death and the imprisonment of his grandmother were not only a shock for their loved ones, but also a deep wound for the entire community. Now, many thought that the tragedy could have been prevented if they had paid attention to the warning signs in time. Alexi's parents. After the trial ended, Alexi's parents tried to find a way to move on with their lives. They were immersed in deep grief and guilt. Every day their thoughts returned to their son, and they asked themselves again and again why they had failed to see the true extent of the problem. Alexi's father could no longer justify his detachment with work and worries. He realized that his lack of intervention and unwillingness to listen to his son's internal conflicts played a role in what had happened. Now he felt destroyed inside, realizing that he had lost not only his son, but his entire family. Alexi's mother, overcome with guilt, tried to make sense of what had happened. She spent her days alone, lost in thoughts about what she could have done differently. She was tormented by the fact that she, as a mother, had failed to protect her son, which had allowed the relationship between Margarita and Alexi to spiral out of control. However, the guilt and despair led to her deep depression, which she had to fight with the help of specialists. The parents not only lost their son, but were also left with the heavy realization that an irreparable tragedy had occurred in their family. They rarely left the house, avoiding conversations with neighbors who now looked at them with pity and condemnation. The tragedy of their family became a public event, discussed by everyone around, and this brought even more pain. Margarita's life in a psychiatric clinic. Meanwhile, Margarita, who remained in custody at the psychiatric clinic, began undergoing treatment. Her condition at the time of her placement in the clinic was grave. She continued to immerse herself in her thoughts, often repeating phrases related to Alexi. Psychiatrists who worked with her noted her deep remorse and confusion about what had happened. She often said that she did not understand how she had come to the point of murder. But in her mind, Alexi was still a part of her life. From time to time, she recalled moments when they were together, and tears appeared in her eyes again. The treatment at the clinic was aimed not only at stabilizing her mental state, but also at helping her understand her actions. However, the process was difficult. Doctors noted that many of her internal problems, such as fear of loneliness, emotional dependence, and inability to control her feelings, had been developing for decades. The borderline disorder she was diagnosed with explained her extreme mood swings and inability to cope with emotional losses. Despite the treatment, Margarita was never able to fully comprehend and accept the fact that she had killed her grandson. Her mind continued to protect her from the full truth, as if trying to shield her from the horror she had committed. At times, she told doctors that she was still waiting for Alexi, thinking that he might return. These moments showed that her perception of reality was severely disturbed. Doctors assumed that Margarita would never be able to return to normal life. Her mental state required constant monitoring and treatment, and she would probably spend the rest of her life in a clinic. For her, this was not just a punishment, but also a kind of liberation from a world she could no longer understand and in which she could no longer exist. Village life after tragedy. The villagers, despite the fact that the trial was over, could not forget about what had happened. This case affected everyone who knew the family of Margarita and Alexi. On the street, at the market, in local shops, people were still discussing how something like this could have happened in their small and seemingly close-knit community. Many wondered, could they have done something to prevent this tragedy? Neighbors and acquaintances felt helpless because no one noticed how deep the problems were within the family. Some villagers recalled strange moments when they noticed how Alexi avoided meetings and conversations, how Margarita was overprotective of him. Now they realized that they had witnessed a serious psychological drama unfolding before their eyes, but no one dared to intervene or ask questions. This feeling of responsibility and guilt overwhelmed many, and the village could no longer remain the same as it had been before this tragedy. Alexi's death and Margarita's arrest affected the overall atmosphere in the village. Residents became more wary of their neighbors, trying to find out more about what was happening behind closed doors. The tragedy became a reminder that even in the most peaceful and quiet places, deep human dramas can occur that go unnoticed until it is too late. The impact of tragedy on society. The story of the murder of her grandson by his grandmother did not go unnoticed outside the village. The media widely covered the case, raising questions about mental health, family relationships, and the responsibility of those around her to prevent such tragedies. The story of Margarita and Alexi became a subject of discussion at various levels, from psychologists and social workers to ordinary people who tried to understand how something like this could happen in an ordinary family. The tragedy also highlighted the need for mental health support among older adults who may suffer from loneliness and emotional dependency, as happened to Margarita. Many experts began discussing the need to create social programs that would help older adults cope with loneliness and ensure early detection of mental disorders. Families across the country who heard this story began to rethink their relationships with elderly relatives. Questions about care, attention, and support for elders began to be discussed in families that previously could ignore the problems of loneliness and emotional connections. The tragedy of Margarita and Alexi became a reminder for everyone of the importance of noticing signs of psychological instability in time and intervening to prevent disasters. Conclusion: the story of Margarita and Alexi remains a tragic reminder of how easily family relationships can cross the line between care and control. This case showed how mental disorders, loneliness, and emotional dependence can lead to devastating consequences if they are not recognized in time and the necessary help is not provided. Now that Margarita remained under medical supervision and Alexi was no longer among the living, the family and those around her began to realize that behind the outwardly normal and calm life, there could be hidden deep internal problems that required attention. The story of Margarita and Alexi left a deep mark not only on their family and village, but on society as a whole. Despite the passage of time, the pain and shock of what happened did not go away. An emotional connection that grew into an unhealthy addiction became the cause of a tragedy that could have been prevented if loved ones and others had intervened in time. Now, months after the trial, it has become clear that the lessons learned from this story can change not only the fates of individuals, but also society's attitude to mental health, family relationships, and social responsibility. Assessment by experts. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers have carefully studied the case of Margarita and Alexi to understand what measures could have been taken to avoid the tragedy. The main conclusion was that emotional dependence and violation of boundaries in relationships can be destructive. Families often do not realize that their loved ones, especially older people, may suffer from depression, loneliness, or mental disorders, which, if left untreated, can lead to catastrophic consequences. Experts began discussing the need to create programs aimed at identifying and preventing emotional dependence in family relationships. These programs could include regular psychological counseling for older people to help them cope with feelings of loneliness and avoid extreme forms of dependence on their children or grandchildren. In addition, experts suggested measures to support families where signs of emotional suppression are observed, as was the case with Alexi. Margarita and Alexi's story also highlighted the importance of raising awareness of issues such as borderline personality disorder, which played a key role in her actions. Doctors and psychiatrists have pointed out that many people suffering from such disorders may not receive the help they need for a long time, which only makes their condition worse. The case has become a reason to raise awareness of mental illness and the need for early diagnosis and treatment. Changing public perception. Following the media coverage of the tragedy, the public began to think differently about mental health and family ties. Many families began to think about what was happening outside their homes and how their loved ones, especially older relatives, were coping with emotional stress and loneliness. Margarita's story became an example of how attention to mental health and family ties should be a priority for everyone. People began to take a more active interest in how their relatives were feeling, especially if they noticed signs of depression, anxiety, or excessive control. Discussions that were previously avoided became more open, which allowed many families to prevent potential problems. Some even sought counseling from psychologists to better understand how to build healthy and harmonious relationships within the family. Support for families who have experienced tragedy. After Alexi's death and Margarita's placement in a psychiatric hospital, his parents remained immersed in deep grief. Despite the years that had passed since the tragedy, they were never able to fully recover. It became obvious to them that ignoring the problems in their family played a key role in what happened. After the trial, they decided to seek professional help to learn how to cope with feelings of guilt and loss. Psychologists helped them understand that they too were victims of this tragedy, as they had not noticed the danger signs for a long time and were unable to intervene in time. Alexi's family, on the advice of specialists, joined a support group for people who had lost loved ones to violence. The group became a source of comfort and strength for them, helping them cope with guilt and understand that even in the most difficult situations it is possible to find a way out and continue living. Gradually, they began to emerge from their emotional isolation, realizing that tragedy should not determine their future lives. Impact on social policy. The case also resonated at the social policy level. Governments began to discuss more actively the need to improve the system of support for older people to prevent similar situations from happening again. Psychological support programs that were previously inaccessible or underdeveloped began to receive more funding and attention. Initiatives were introduced to teach families to recognize the signs of emotional suppression and psychological disorders in loved ones. Particular attention was paid to training social workers and specialists in elderly care. These programs are aimed at identifying early signs of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety disorders, and borderline personality disorder. The goal of these initiatives is to prevent the development of emotional dependencies that can become dangerous for both the patient and his family. In addition, programs have been developed for older adults to help them remain socially active and involved in community life, reducing the risk of developing feelings of loneliness and isolation. These programs include both psychological support and social activities where older adults can interact with others and feel needed and important. Long-term consequences for the village. The village where the tragedy occurred could not remain the same either. Although time heals wounds, residents still remembered this terrible event. It became a reminder that even if everything looks fine on the outside, something much darker can happen behind closed doors. After Alexi's death and Margarita's imprisonment, residents began to pay more attention to their neighbors. Some began to communicate more, trying to make sure that those living nearby did not need help. The attitude towards the elderly has changed especially. Previously, the village community rarely thought about the fact that elderly residents may need not only physical help, but also emotional support. Now, many began to invite their neighbors to joint events, organize meetings to help the elderly not feel lonely and isolated. The community became more united, and this new tradition strengthened the ties between residents. The tragedy of Margarita and Alexi was a painful but important lesson for everyone. It showed how important it is to notice changes in the behavior of loved ones in time and to seek help before the situation gets out of control. It became a reminder that even the most simple and familiar conditions can hide serious problems, and that attentiveness, care, and support can save lives. Conclusion. The story of Margarita and Alexi will remain in people's memories not only as a tragic case of domestic violence, but also as an example of what emotional dependency and lack of attention to mental health can lead to. This case has become a call to action for families, social workers, and mental health professionals. Society must be prepared to recognize problems in time and take measures to ensure that such tragedies do not happen again. Margarita remained in the hospital, where her life continued under the supervision of doctors. Alexi, whose life was cut short too soon, became a reminder of the devastating consequences of emotional pressure and psychological trauma. His memory lived on among those who knew and loved him, and his story became a warning to future generations about the importance of mental health and maintaining healthy relationships within the family.